started recording now. Make sure everything is good. Okay. So, after talking a bird's eye view about Deng Xiaoping and Deng Xiaoping theory, we know the politics now, we know the background now, but we don't know the personalized stories of the Chinese people. And we have a very, very special guest here, Charles Zha, who knows basically the ins and outs of the history of China, culture, system, and whatnot. And I invited him today to talk about his familial and personal experiences in China, growing up in China, whether it was under Mao, Deng Xiaoping, and how he sees the development today. Welcome, Carl. How's it going? Go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Carl. I was born and raised in China in the 1980s. So I was born 1 month after Mao died. So my growing up, my childhood growing up in China in 1980s China, I experienced the firsthand the Deng Xiaoping era. And I came to US in 1990 to join my family. My dad was one of the first generation of Chinese students after the opening and reform to go out to go abroad, and he
Mm.
studied electrical engineering in US and in 1985. And so I joined him in 1990, and my family chose to stay in United States.
Mm.
So I grew up there. I went to high school, college, uh, and I was since 1990. Now it's 2020, so that's what, like 30 years.
30 years.
Well, yeah, yeah. So I actually spent more time in U.S. and China, but my formative years growing up that was spent in China, the
Sure.
entire decade of 80s, basically. And so thank you for inviting me again to talk about this, because I love to talk, and I love to share my own personal stories.
Yeah.
What is where should I go from here?
Well, since we're kind of going chronologically, we already dove into Deng Xiaoping and what he kind of went through politically in order to promote his opening up and reform. We touched a little bit about the history on what led up to the Chinese Revolution and what happened during the Mao era. But if you want, let's go touch there. Let's touch on the history of China, what led up to the revolution, and if you can, give us a little perspective of what your family went through under Mao before Deng
Oh, sure,
Xiaoping.
sure. So basically, China, when the Europeans first came to China to trade in large numbers, China was ruled by its last dynasty, the Qing dynasty, and most of us are aware of the Opium War and how the British Empire tried to push drugs onto the Chinese population. And uh, as a result of the predation by the Western powers, the Qing dynasty China was greatly weakened. And after 1911 Chinese revolutions, the Qing Empire collapsed. But in its place, it's a collection of Chinese warlords running things on the ground. Like when we study history chronologically, they say, "Oh, the Republic of China replaced the Qing imperial government," but that is only on paper. I need
Yeah.
to stress that China was not a unitary state after the collapse of Qing dynasty in 1911. Instead, it's on the ground, it's run by local warlords. In the villages, on the village level, it's ruled by the landlords. And
Wow.
so after that, China experienced even more foreign invasion by the Japanese in World War II.
Hmm.
So what happened was what the Japanese invasion did. It destroyed a lot of the superstructure uh, that was there before. A lot of the uh, warlord control of the countryside was wiped away in the
Hmm.
Japanese occupied area, and that
Hmm.
actually give presented opportunity for the communists, because
Sure.
the communists they were the best organized party to take advantage of that. They move into because the Japanese, they weren't able to effectively establish control because they control all the big cities.
Mm.
But in the countryside, there was a power vacuum after the previous control was wiped away. And
Wow.
the Communist Party, who through the Long March, they moved themselves to northwest China, where they established a base, and then they send in their cadres to the
Mm.
Japanese occupied areas, and they establish like a parallel shadow government on the ground. So the Japanese still rely on the collaborators to collect taxes, to enforce their rule. But when the Japanese troops leave, the communist guerrillas will move in, and then they will organize the villagers. They will punish the collaborators, and
Wow.
so essentially, in the communists contested the Japanese control of much of northern occupied China. By the Japanese surrender, uh, the communist base were well established in the previously occupied China, and then there was a rush between the communists and the KMT, the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek,
Hmm.
to take over. To take over the Japanese occupied areas. Now, this is the time when the Cold War is starting between United States and Soviet Union,
Right.
and U.S. was heavily involved in subsidizing Chiang Kai-shek's effort, because Japan took over a large swath of China, both north and south, and most of the Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist army were in the southwest corner of China. And the communists, they were a lot closer. They were, in most cases, they were on the ground, but the but the Chiang Kai-shek issued an order to the Japanese that do not surrender to the communists. Wait for us to get here. And
Wow.
and so U.S. there was the largest U.S. military operation in Asia after World War II. It's called the Operation Beleaguer. So U.S. actually sent in over 60,000 military personnel to China.
Wow.
One objective was to evacuate uh, send home all the Japanese who had been in China,
Mm.
during the Japanese colonization period, to repatriate them, and also to assist Chiang Kai-shek's effort of uh, taking over from the Japanese, rather than having the communists take over the country.
Wow.
And they also tried to broker a peace settlement between the communists and the KMT, because U.S. wanted China to be its kind of junior partner in East Asia against
Right.
Soviet Union. Basically, U.S. wanted China to play the role that Japan is currently playing right now for U.S. As a U.S. client state in Asia
Interesting.
against the Soviets, and then of course that Soviet Union was well aware of that, and they for their part they start to support the Chinese communists. I mean, they were supporting them before, but at this time they were also the Soviet also happened to be in China, because at the end of World War II, Soviet declared war on Japan, and
Mm.
in the August storm in late 1945, Soviet took over the entire northeast China, or what's sometimes called Manchuria,
Mm.
and in the Soviet expectation is that the Soviet Union will maintain certain privileges that the Tsarist Russia had in those parts of China. And in their negotiation with Chiang Kai-shek, it was understood that they will recognize Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government as legitimate. In return, the Chiang Kai-shek will respect a Soviet sphere of influence in northeast China, in Manchuria, and places like Xinjiang. uh, But what happened next was U.S. Marines start shipping. U.S. Navy. Actually, that's a little known fact. Was after World War II, the headquarters of U.S. 7th Fleet was in China, was in
Hmm.
Qingdao, China,
Wow.
and so U.S. Navy involving a large-scale operation to ship Chiang Kai-shek's troops to all the previously Japanese occupied areas to take over,
Hmm.
and that included Manchuria. But the communists, they were a lot closer, so they sent their own troops and their own cadres into Manchuria, and in this race, right? So when U.S. started to really pushing against the Soviet zone of influence, they started sending the U.S. Marines really close to Manchuria, just right on the border, to shipping the KMT troops over, and Stalin was alarmed. So Soviet Union felt that Chiang Kai-shek was going back on the deal of respecting
Interesting.
the Soviet privileges in its zone of influence. So in exchange, the Soviet increased their backing for the Chinese communists. That including in the city they control, in the area the Red Army still control, they hand over the arsenals of the Japanese army to the communists, and
Wow.
and what happened then is civil war followed between the communists and the KMT. It happened everywhere, not just in Manchuria, but all over China, because Chiang Kai-shek saw this as an opportunity to wipe out the communists. A lot
Hmm.
of the U.S. aid to China for the war, for the World War II effort fighting against the Japanese, actually never made it through China during the war. So a lot of the land lease equipment actually made it after the war, and it was just perfect for Chiang Kai-shek, because he wanted to use these American equipment to fight the Civil
What
War.
a coincidence, huh?
Yes. And to everyone's surprise, the communists, because they're a lot more cohesive uh, than the uh, Chiang Kai-shek's party structure, they came out despite being vastly outnumbered in the beginning. And so that concludes the Chinese Civil War, and the communists end up pushing the Chiang Kai-shek's government to Taiwan,
Right.
right,
Right.
where they remain. And and then in 1949, Mao declares the establishment of People's Republic of China on top of Tiananmen Gate, and then China started its new phase, the socialist transformation, which I'm sure you guys have talked about.
Yep.
And now, what's one thing I need to point out, like what really driven the communists initially was nationalism, because um, a lot of the Chinese youth, they were seeking ways to revitalize China and to expel the Western imperialist powers. They tried different approaches. Initially, they tried to adopt the Western model,
Right.
but that didn't work. And when the Russian Revolution happened, that they saw it as an alternative path to
Hmm.
modernity, and and this is how the educated Chinese youth started to turn toward communism as a path to save China,
Hmm.
and and that is a very important drive. I would say a very important driver for uh, Mao's um, attempt to build the new socialist utopia, because Mao has he's a full believer in
Right.
communism and
Right.
in building a classless society where everyone is equal, and he also believed that it's not only just the best way forward for China, but for the rest of the world as well. That's why during Mao era, he sponsored revolutions all across the globe,
Right.
and um, and with but Mao was impatient, right? Because by the time Mao became the leader of China with establishment of People's Republic, uh, Mao is well over his middle age, and
Mhm.
he had this impatient drive to bring China to modernization, to modernize
Right.
China, and he thought the best way forward is through communism. Except he wanted to fast forward to communism, right?
Yeah.
Supercharge it, and
Right.
that
Right.
led to great leap forward and cultural revolution. So people need to understand that, like a lot of the detractors of Mao in the West, they try to paint Mao as like just this power hungry dictator. Everything is driven by power, but that would not be able to explain, what he did once he became the Chinese leader. Then cultural, to maintain power, great leap forward and cultural revolution is totally unnecessary. He's
Right. Right.
already the paramount leader. But what Mao really wanted to do is to speed up the process where China can enter into a classless society, into
Mhm.
the utopia he wanted. And to do that, he launched the Great Leap Forward, which there was a lot of mistake made in its implementation, which
Right.
caused a lot of hardship.
Right.
And and in response to that, in 19 after in the immediate aftermath of Great Leap Forward, uh, after the effect were apparent, now the old Communist Party bureaucracy sort of took over, reasserted
Right.
itself. So that was represented by Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping, right, who
Mm.
were like former protege of Mao and groomed to take over, and now they asserted themselves and started to adopt a more practical approach, like a more gradual process to for socialist transformation. Um, but Mao saw that as a betrayal of his own ideals, because Mao saw that as a deviation, right,
Yep.
from his
Yep.
path toward communism, and that is the rationale for Mao to launch the Great Cultural Revolution,
Yep.
because Mao saw that in his way, he saw uh, China was reverting back to kind of the technocratic control by a class of Confucian elites that, like
Mm.
in the old feudal days, and that's why he wanted to purge the communist bureaucracy. Basically, he wanted to destroy the
Mm.
bureaucracy that he helped to build in the
Right.
beginning, because he thought this bureaucracy has gone off uh, the, the right path, and
Yeah.
he wanted to revamp the whole system.
Mm.
So I'm sure you guys cover that as well. So I'm just going briefly so we can get to the Deng Xiaoping era.
Yeah,
Um,
for sure.
as I stated in the beginning, I was born right after the death of Mao, so I didn't personally experience the Cultural Revolution, but I grew up with stories told in my family,
Mm.
because these are experienced by my grandparents and my parents. A lot of people, uh, like a lot of Western media pundits say, oh, China, they don't teach about Cultural Revolution. The Chinese youth are not aware what happened. That's
Mm.
not true, because I
Right.
don't need to go to school to learn about Cultural Revolution. I learned
Right.
firsthand from the stories handing down in my family. So my family, my my both of my grandparents, they were highly supportive of the communist revolution towards the
Mm.
end of the Chinese Civil War, as majority of the Chinese people, because at that time, after 8 years of fighting the Japanese, most of the Chinese populace just wanted peace. They
Mm.
wanted to return to normalcy. But Chiang Kai-shek, in pursuit of total power, he waged this very unpopular civil war against the communists. And in doing so, uh, when Chinese industry was already devastated, um, and diverting all the resources towards a civil war, he caused hyperinflation, and to counter that, he was resort to money printing, which caused super hyperinflation,
Wow.
and
Yeah,
so at the
definitely.
end. by 1949, Chiang Kai-shek was unpopular through most of
Mm.
China, and my grandparents, so on my grandparents on my dad's side, my grandpa, he came from like the old Chinese gentry, but by his time, uh, his family fortune already declined because it's just like the rest of China, just like the Qing dynasty China, the old gentry, the life is not good even for the old gentry. And on top
Mm.
of that, my grandpa was not. He was born from a concubine from my great grandparent, my
Wow.
great grandpa. So
Huh.
he under Chinese. Under the traditional Chinese legal system, all the sons, all the male heirs are entitled an equal share of his father's inheritance. But his my grandpa's brother didn't want to give him the family land
Right. Right.
because it's a brother from another mother, and
Yep.
then he what they what his brother did then was he chose to marry him off out of the family because my grandpa come from a uh, well-known lineage, so they have, even though they're not as well-to-do as before, so they still have the prestige of the name. So they married off my grandpa to an upcoming, like you can say, nouveau riche, a landlord family. So
Interesting.
where my grandma come with some land. So my grandma's my grandma's father sponsored my grandpa's education, sent him to learn Chinese traditional medicine so he can support himself. So
Wow.
so my grandpa was born from an old landlord family, but he ended up becoming just a traditional practitioner of traditional Chinese medicine because he got kicked out of the family. Um,
Huh.
and but then they lived through the Japanese occupation. When the Japanese launched the invasion of Shanghai in 1937, my grandparents' hometown were right on the path of the Japanese Imperial Army advance. So the whole town was leveled by the Japanese bombing.
Wow.
Um, and my grandma at the time, she was newly married, just had a kid, and pregnant with her second child of my uncle. So she had to go hide in the countryside from the
Mm.
Japanese troop advance.
Mm.
And I visited my my grandparents' hometown last year, and I noticed like there almost like no structure that no old structure from before 1930s survived.
Wow.
So when I asked, because the whole town was destroyed in the war,
Wow.
um, and so they lived through that kind of the turmoil of China in the early 20th century, and by 1949. When they see that Chiang Kai-shek was losing the war, they actually see the communists as a possible they saw it as a force for change, right? Because
Right.
whatever it was doing work happening before, it wasn't working. Before under the warlords era, and then under the Chiang Kai-shek's reign, and then under the Japanese puppet government, they had enough. They wanted change, and the communists represented the force for change. And on my mother's side, my my grandpa, my maternal grandfather, was also very similarly. He came from a land owning family, but my grandpa's my grandpa's second eldest brother became an opium addict, so he
Wow.
smoked away the family fortune, and
Wow.
and and my grandpa was only so when he was young, he was fortunate enough to be educated through like his early years. When his family could still afford private tutors to teach him how to read and write. But
Mm.
but by the time he was due for middle school, the family ran out of money because the older brothers smoked away the family fortune. So he essentially was changed overnight from being a part of the landlord family to part of the proletariat, because
Mm.
he became apprentice. He did a lot of things. He sold vegetable. He became a vegetable peddler in the market. He became a apprentice to chef. So my grandpa is a very good chef
Wow.
because when he was young, he was apprenticed to be a chef. and
Interesting.
and then when he was doing all these odd jobs, he attended night classes at the University of Chongqing, trying to further his education, and he learned everything on his own. So he took this was a time when the Western style education was still being introduced to China.
Hmm.
From the old from the old style, just learning the Confucian classic. Now the Western style education was being propagated throughout China, and my grandpa, through his night classes at University of Chongqing, he gained enough knowledge to pass a certain test, and he passed himself as a college grad, even though he was totally not a college grad. And but he was able to package himself and land himself a job as a high school teacher.
Nice.
And he told me the story that this was the time when, I said, like, modern education was just starting. So when he land his first job as a high school teacher, he was expected to teach everything from math, English to literature, right? And my
Wow.
grandpa's like, I didn't know English. He had literally read the English books, before his class, before he teaches his students. A lot of his students were older than him because
Wow.
he was maybe like at the time 20, and this was a transition time, so a lot of people are switching to this modern education. So
Sure.
some of his students are like older than 20, and and
Wow.
and he, and he managed, kind of through his own effort, by the just before the communist revolution, he was a high school principal.
Hmm.
He helped found one of the school that was attached to a textile industry, a textile factory that was opened up by his friend. So he and but as I mentioned, Chiang Kai-shek redirected all the effort towards civil war
Right.
by late 1940s. So the factory was taken over by Chiang Kai-shek's KMT government, and then they nationalized it and made it to produce army uniforms for the KMT
Wow.
army. Yeah, and so because of that, my 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 grandpa, which would land my grandpa in trouble later, because now my grandpa has an association with the
Right.
KMT, munition army uniform factory, just because he was a high school principal teaching at the school that was attached to it. And on
Wow.
my father's side, I mentioned my dad, my grandpa was a doctor, was a Chinese doctor. So he
Hmm.
had he his house was, he was still living in the countryside. He would travel to the towns to practice. But at the time of the Japanese occupation, the Japanese troops put checkpoints in all Chinese cities. This is when
Wow.
the Chinese city still have city walls. They have a city gate where you go in, and
Really?
so the Japanese put Japanese soldiers at each city gate to
Huh.
check papers. And the Japanese military required all the Chinese civilians to salute the Japanese soldiers as they pass through, right? So
Wow.
for my grandpa, who came from a scholar, official, gentry family, to be made to salute occupying Japanese soldiers. For him, that's a great humiliation.
Right,
And so
right.
when he was going through the checkpoint, he pretended he did not hear the command, but that that didn't work. The Japanese soldiers stopped him and
Mm.
slapped him across the face in public as a punishment. And
Oh,
and 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 my grandpa took that really hard because for him that is there's a Chinese phrase in called 士可杀不可辱, which means you can kill me, but you cannot humiliate me. So
right.
so to take revenge for his own personal humiliation, he decided to seek out underground resistance against the Japanese. But
Wow.
in his area, the communists, there was no communists in his area, so the
Mm.
underground resistance in the area of my paternal grandfather was affiliated with his KMT, right? So they look at him, they say, okay, well, you know how to read and write, you can be in charge of the propaganda. So they made him like uh, producing anti-Japanese propaganda posters, and they would plaster around the town in the night. I kind of
Interesting.
picture my grandpa as like uh, Brian in the Life of Brian. I don't know if you know that movie, the Monty Python Life
Yep,
of
yep.
Brian. So I picture my grandpa in the night throwing all these anti-Japanese propaganda poster all over town. But
Amazing.
when at the end of the war, during the Japanese surrender, when the Chiang Kai-shek's government came back, they sent their own officials to come to these towns to take over. And so they basically told my grandpa, oh, thank you for your effort. Now you can go home, because they wanted to send their own men, own people loyal to Chiang Kai-shek to take over these parts. So, my grandpa would just send home to resume his normal civilian life. But because
Huh.
also because of that, because you will also get my other grandpa in trouble because he now has this affiliation with KMT. He was a card carrying member of KMT
Wow. Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah, yeah.
during the Japanese occupation period. But despite both of my grandpa's KMT affiliation, they were supportive of the communist revolution because they saw Chiang Kai-shek was super corrupt, and
Right.
it was bringing ruin to China for pursuing the civil war. And they were all uh, like very supportive when the People's Liberation Army rolled into the town and liberated them. Then, according to my grandpa's, life was good in the early 50s. So in the immediate aftermath of founding of People's Republic of China, because one important factor is the war finally ended. After 1911, after the overthrow of Qing dynasty, China was been in various level of conflict, right, for the last
Mm.
40 years.
Right.
And finally, that's coming to an end, and the economy was starting to recover. And then in 1957, the Anti-Rightist Campaign started. So this is a
Mm.
time when Mao's, in preparation for Great Leap Forward, um, he was pushing to for a greater collectivization and nationalizing economy, which are good, with very
Right.
good intentions.
Right.
But uh, but at the same time, Mao also invited intellectuals to criticize the Communist Party for any wrongdoing. Um,
Interesting.
but
Hey, Carl,
unexpected,
so
yeah,
sorry to interrupt. My
yeah,
camera all of a sudden the battery's kind of running low. I'm gonna switch it very quickly. I'm gonna
okay.
try to see if the recording can keep going. So give me
Okay,
one
I'm gonna
second and I
take
can
a
switch it up.
bathroom break for a second
Yeah,
then while you do that. Perfect.
sure.
Okay, I'll be
Let's
right
do
back.
it.
Hello, it's my show
Yeah,
now.
okay. You see me?
Yes.
Okay, that was actually a really efficient pit stop, so that worked out very well. Okay, Now that I know that it looks like we're still recording, I got the
Okay.
camera set up. So we just left off with just when Mao was starting his anti-rightist campaign and
Yes.
getting into the Great Leap Forward.
Yes. Well, the intention of Mao originally was to invite outside criticism of the party to help the party to improve, right? Which, it comes from the right place. But what ended up happening is uh, the Communist Party leadership wasn't prepared for the level and the amount of criticism it opened up. And also at this time, at the same time, a lot of the Chinese liberals who were in a broad coalition with the communists at this time, they also had unrealistic expectation of power sharing, right?
Mm,
Because during both the struggle against the Japanese and the Civil War, Communist Party formed the so-called United Front, which
mm,
means unite all the forces who we share the common goal, which is to expel the Japanese invaders and to bring down Chiang Kai-shek regime,
right.
right? So even that included even landlord capitalists, whoever support us, we can accommodate. uh, basically a Big Ten strategy, right?
Hmm.
That started to change a little bit during the Civil War, because then the communists, they start to pursue land reform, right? And the land reform involving taking away land from landlords and redistributing them to landless
Right.
peasants. And then in the early 1950s, communists started to pursue nationalization, right? So which means they first did it by just buying off the capitalists, taking over their firms and making it state-owned industries.
Mm,
Now, so by after mid 50s, when the communists Mao officially called for the let 100 flower bloom, which means like welcome all kind of speech, especially
uh-huh.
criticism against the Communist Party. It opened up a floodgate, and 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 what the Communist Party membership was not prepared was for the level and the volume of criticism level at the Communist Party.
Wow.
And at this point, uh, I'll eat after. Thank you. And, and that's my wife telling me to eat. and
Nice.
and then that's what prompted the anti-rightist campaign, because Mao felt now this is an intentional sabotage, right?
Mm,
There's a reactionary element trying to seize the opportunity to undermine and sabotage the Communist Party rule of China.
mm,
And that's what turned into the anti-rightist campaign. And
right.
what now, keep in mind, I know show is about Deng Xiaoping. So by this time, Deng Xiaoping is still a very loyal follower and supporter of Mao's policy.
Yep.
Deng Xiaoping was one of these implementers of Mao's policy during this time,
Right.
and he faithfully carried out Mao's directives. But during the rightist campaign, uh, it, it um, in the way that the Communist Party did things, they started to, from the beginning, it was to single out some Chinese liberals who level harsh criticism at the Communist Party, but it soon kind of expanded in scope. And the Chinese Communist Party, they do things by quotas, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
They do things by quota. So when you have the quota from the top, say, okay, like maybe we need to get 10% of these.
Yep. Yep.
Maybe we need to get 10% of these people criticizing the Communist Party policies. On the ground, when you translate when the policy gets translated, is what it means. Like, people are looking to fill these quotas by
Wow.
dragging anybody who is suspected to be a rightist. So then and then they start to dig into people's family background, right? And that's when my grandparents got into trouble, because that's when they
Interesting. Huh.
find out, hey, my dad's father, hey, you used to be KMT back in the Japanese occupation
Wow.
period. So he was called the unofficial rightist. What it means, he was labeled a rightist, but it was not publicized,
I see.
because they still need him, because he offered a very valuable service as a doctor. You know,
Interesting.
doctors is his service
Wow.
still needed. So what happened was his salary was cut. Like
Oh,
his salary was cut to 20% of like his salary was cut fivefold. So he's now only earning 20% of what he was earning previously,
wow.
as kind of atonement for his past sins of joining the
Wow.
KMT party. And then he was also had to attend some self-criticism sessions
Hmm.
at that time. It was This was also the time when it, it- so my uncle, this also happened affect their family members when the head of the house get labeled as a rightist. Um,
Sure.
my my oldest uncle, who was already born when the Japanese came, he already completed his college education before liberation, before 1949, so he's fine.
Okay.
But my second oldest uncle, who was a brilliant student, according to my dad, he considered my second uncle to be like the most brilliant among his siblings. He was a top student in their city. In fact, he
Hmm.
scored the highest in the college entrance exams. But
Wow.
he was not allowed to go to college because of my grandpa. Because my grandpa was a past KMT. So
Wow.
now people, like the people's background actually decided their fate. The
Wow.
people with so-called the people so-called from bad elements, or with bad class associations, like my uncles, they weren't allowed to pursue college education. Well, back then also, the Chinese public education is free, right? So
Huh.
you go to college for free. The state
Wow.
pays for like the room and board. and
Interesting.
but they say, well, since it's a privilege, we cannot give it
Hmm.
to the privilege to the um, to these to the children of former bourgeoisie. The also idea was, to make the class level, to level the
Right.
class differences, right?
Yeah.
We should give this opportunities to children of workers and peasants, etc.
Hmm.
So in that case, but it gets worse, because not only my uncle was not allowed to go to college, he couldn't get a job at the others. He wanted to be a factory worker, right? Because
Hmm.
at the time, to be a worker is being a part of the proletariat, is being
Sure.
revolutionary. So he wanted
Yeah.
to be participate in the revolution. He wanted to be a factory worker, but he was, again, like there's a lot of people wanted lining up to be factory workers.
Right. Right.
He is not allowed he was not allowed to work in a factory, again, because his own dad was a KMT.
Right.
But in the end, the county government decided what they do need is more doctors trained
Hmm.
in medicine. So he wanted, they assigned my uncle to study under my grandpa, because
Wow.
um, and but my uncle actually didn't want to, because my uncle at the time, he thought, wow, we live in the nuclear age. Now we're splitting atoms. Why the heck am I learning traditional Chinese medicine? Because it's all sounded voodoo to him, and he
Right.
believed in
Okay. Yeah.
science, right? He
Interesting.
feels like this Chinese medicine stuff is all voodoo, and so he's very reluctant. But that was his only life option. Was like
Yeah.
they made him an offer he couldn't refuse. It's like,
There you
okay,
go.
study under your father, or you don't get a job at all. And so but at the same time, my uncle had to attend like these kind of struggle sessions where my grandpa was made to do self-criticism. So it was very hard for him.
Yeah.
First he didn't want to be there, and then he really didn't want to be there when his dad was being made to do self-criticism in front of everybody in the
Wow.
struggle session. And then on my mother's side, uh, my grandpa, who, as I mentioned before, was a high school principal. But one of the student he took in, one of his student, one of the young teacher, he kind of took under his wings because this person came from a poor family background. So my uh, but he's very brilliant. So my grandpa really liked him. So he would always buy buy meals for him and into
Sure.
like showing him the trade basically.
Hmm.
But this guy during the anti-rightist campaign, he saw it as an opportunity, by removing my grandpa from the position of principal as a
Oof.
stepping stone for his own promotion. So he went to he attacked my grandpa as a corrupt holdover from the KMT era because my grandpa was inviting all these young teachers to go out to eat. That must mean my grandpa is corrupt. My grandpa must be in the because at this time the schools has also been nationalized. So all the
Right.
like the school that the school was attached to, I should say, a textile factory was producing uniforms for the KMT army. But by the time in 1950, all the factories are nationalized. So now the school
Hmm.
attached to the factory also nationalized. So they're accusing my grandpa of corruption. He must have some funds that's unaccounted for, and two, he because um, he's a bourgeoisie background. So my grandpa is not. My grandpa is one of these type of people who care more about face than anything else. So at the
Sure.
time in 1950s, they allow you to fill out your own class background, right?
Hmm.
My grandma, the woman my grandma, my mother's mother, actually came from a from a very powerful family
Hmm.
in Chongqing. Like her ancestor was one of the first to settle the area during the Qing dynasty. So the Wang
Sure.
family was a very powerful clan, and her her second brother was actually the police chief of the district. So
Wow.
in my grandma's words, if her brother survived till revolution, he will for sure be executed for crime against the people. And but my grandma, sort of lucky for him, she was also born from a junior wife, and and at the time when she was born, my great grandpa was already like 60 years old, and like basically uh, this was during the warlord era when China was a civil war, and my grandma was a concubine of one of these warlords,
Right.
one of the officers in the warlord's army, and
Hmm.
the army of Yunnan, just a province in the southwest corner of China. The warlord army of Yunnan went into Sichuan. They took it over briefly for a while, and
Wow.
then there were a few years. Actually, at the time, they were led by Zhu De, who would later become the supreme commander of PLA army. Back then,
Huh.
Zhu De was a warlord general, and
Huh.
and and so the Yunnan army went into Sichuan area. They took over Chongqing, but after a few years, they were defeated by the Sichuanese warlord. So the Sichuanese army pushed them out, and
Wow.
when they left. My great grandma was stranded because her husband either got killed or retreated with the army, and she was this woman. a former concubine stranded all alone, and my great grandpa took her in essentially. Like he was
Sure.
already in his 60s, and he was a widower, so I guess he was looking for a wife. So she took in
Sure.
my great grandma, and then they had my grandma. But my great grandpa already had a whole bunch of children, and all the children had the expectation of inheriting the family land because
Mm-hmm.
they're a great
Mm-hmm.
family. And at the time, my grandma's brothers actually said, "Well, let's see what it comes out. If it's a son, we'll just throw him in the fire,
Wow.
burn." Because under Chinese old legal code, all the sons, no matter born from concubine or maid wife, are entitled to piece of inheritance.
Right.
So
Right.
they say,
Right.
well, if it's a son, we'll just throw him in the fire, so we don't have to
Wow.
share the
Huh.
dad's inheritance. But luckily for my grandma, she's a girl,
Sure.
and
Sure.
so she's not a threat. So they just sent her off with her after my great grandpa's death. She just sent her off with my great grandma uh, to live on some like a little piece of land
Hmm.
that they gave them to sustain them, and so my um, my great grandpa was also a practitioner of Chinese medicine.
Hmm.
But he did it more because he didn't have to, but he did it because that's his passion.
Right.
Even though he came from a landed family. Uh,
Hmm.
but my grandma was smart. So in 1950s, when they asked you to voluntarily fill out your class background, my my grandma filled out her father is an urban professional because he
Huh.
was a doctor.
There you
right
go.
right even though her father's family was this great landlord, and her brother was a police
Wow.
chief, right? But I mean, her relationship was pretty strained with that family anyway, because
Sure.
they would have killed her if he was a boy.
Yeah.
She was a boy,
I was gonna
and
say, lucky.
yeah, and but my grandpa, my mother's father, he cared more about faith. So even though originally he came from a landlord family, but the family lost their fortune, so he had to start from the bottom, like
Right.
washing dishes and being
Wow.
apprenticed to a chef. But instead of writing that, when they asked for the class background, he wrote landlord.
Oh. Okay. Shoot.
Yeah, because he wasn't thinking about the implications. So what happened when the anti-rightist campaign started? Well, he has landlord background. He working at KMT affiliated factory.
Oof.
He was accused of corruption by his own teachers.
Right.
So he was sent to he was sent to the he was to sent to a re-education through labor camp.
Wow.
Like officially they didn't call it that. Officially they call it at the time they call it 武艺干校, or the school for the cadres.
Huh.
It's supposed to like improve their class consciousness by working in the field in the countryside with the farmers.
Interesting.
But essentially, my grandpa was sent to the countryside to go through this labor reforms through labor program, and my
Wow.
and his family lost income because he's no longer
Right.
the school principal. But luckily so thankfully my grandma, she before all this happened, right around the time of liberation, she refused to be a housewife. My grandpa told her, like, you can be I can support you. I'm a high school principal. You can just stay home and raise kids.
Uh-huh.
But my grandma, she was her marriage was arranged. She was eight. She was she was she was also for the first generation of Chinese women to get a modern education.
Right.
When she went through high school, one of her teacher was a communist, and her teacher, I think her teacher liked her and told her like that he was going to the communist base in Yan'an, right, which was a
Wow.
popular thing to do among the leftist progressives, and
Wow.
asked her to go with him.
Huh.
And my grandma also had a crush on her teacher, and so she almost went. and
Wow.
so but my great grandma find out, and her only daughter was gonna elope with some as a communist teacher to the communist base. So she put a stop to that by quickly arrange her a marriage with my
Wow.
grandpa. and
Okay.
and so straight out of high school, my grandma was 18, she got married, and then my grandpa told her, it's like, look, you can stay home and raise kids, be a traditional Chinese woman. And my grandma's, but this is right around the time of founding a PRC, and women's liberation is a big thing. My grandma's like, no, like, I
Right.
want to go
Right.
to school. I want to pursue a college education. So she went
Mm.
to a teacher's college, and where she got a teacher certificate, and she became a teacher. And because of that, when my grandpa lost his job and got to sent to the labor camp, my grandma supported the entire family, the
Nice.
five kids and
Interesting.
the five, so this was the kind of experience my family went through during
Kind
this
of the best of both
pre
worlds where one,
yeah,
one got punished, but the other got rewarded, kind of, landlord, but, friend to the communist sort of thing. Really
yeah,
interesting. That's
yeah. I mean, it's there's a lot of layer to that. And so my grandma was okay because she said her own dad is a urban professional, so she kept her job as a teacher,
sure.
and she kept through she kept working throughout, cultural revolution, and she supported her family through her salary. And
Wow.
and then, you know uh after, in the witness the aftermath of, anti-rightist campaign, Great Leap Forward, I think that's when Deng Xiaoping has, different evaluation of Mao's policies, and
Right.
that's why in the early 60s, him and Liu Shaoqi kind of decide to ease off on this fast track to communism
Hmm.
approach, started by Mao. And this was also a brief period of time when there was a relaxation period. Remember when I said my second uncle was not allowed to go to college?
Right. Right.
In the early 60s, after the Great Leap Forward and the famine, there was a brief time of relaxation when
Hmm.
there was a time when Marshal Chen Yi, when publicly said, a person's worth should not be determined by their parents. Like, a
Right.
person should be able to make their own path. That's right around the time my dad graduated high school. And so
Oh,
when
wow.
my dad also tested number one in his city. He
Huh.
scored number one in his on his college entrance exam, and to his surprise and joy, he was allowed to apply to college. But he was
Wow.
still scared to apply for the top number one school or technical school, which is would be Tsinghua University.
Right. Right.
He,
Right.
he was still scared because he thought he might get rejected because um, of his dad, my grandpa's
Background.
KMT
Yeah.
background. So he decided to apply to like the number two school. So he
Huh.
applied for Xi'an Jiaoda, the Jiaotong University of Jiaotong University in China.
Wow.
And this was also the time when China was also going. So Jiaotong University used to be based in Shanghai, but in the 1960s, uh, this after Korean War, this was when the Chiang Kai-shek's Air Force were still flying to mainland and bombing bombing mainland cities. So the Mao thought, let's not put all our basket on the coastal China where it's
Yeah.
susceptible to a U.S. backed invasion. So they
Hmm.
relocated Jiaotong University to Xi'an, which is way in the northwest part of China.
Okay. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then so that's how my dad ended up going to Xi'an Jiaotong University. But then when during the move of Jiaotong University, then they realized, oh, but there's the school, the naval school for Jiaotong University. It doesn't make sense to move that away from the coast to inland. So the naval school and the maritime science part stayed in Shanghai. So that's how Jiaotong University became two. Now there's
Split.
a Shanghai
Okay.
Jiaotong University and Xi'an Jiaotong
Interesting.
University. And then my dad, so my dad is a couple years older than my mom.
Okay.
So by the time my mom graduated high school, Cultural Revolution already started.
Mm,
So this will be 1966. Again, my mom, even though she was a top student in her class, well liked by her teachers, she was not given the option to go to college because
I see. Wow.
that's not that was just because my grandpa
Right.
was
Right.
a rightist, quote unquote.
Right.
So at this time, my mom was actually a Red Guard. She was
Oh,
very,
wow.
yeah. She wanted to cut off her family ties. She
Huh.
went through. She went home and she criticized. In school she criticized her dad, her mom, and she went home. She went through all my grandpa's photos, old photos. So
Yeah.
my grandparents' wedding photo, my grandpa was wearing a Western suit, right?
Mm,
And by the time of Cultural Revolution, Western suit is considered too bourgeois.
yeah. Yeah.
That's bourgeois. So that's bad. And
Right.
so my mom cut up the wedding picture of my
Wow.
grandparents.
Oh, wow.
and but this is a common story during Cultural Revolution. A lot of the
Yeah.
Chinese children, they were denouncing their own parents.
Yeah.
Um, and
Would you say
and to
the sorry to interrupt, but would you say the Cultural Revolution was a lot more intense than the Anti-Rightist Campaign in the Great Leap Forward,
um,
or just kind
yes,
of
yes.
different? Yeah.
It's different because its target group is different.
Mm,
Because it builds up on top of already the 1950s anti-rightist campaign. Um,
right.
because all the people who have been labeled rightists are still bad elements,
Yeah.
even more untouchable during Cultural Revolution. But on Cultural Revolution have a different target group now because
Mm,
Mao is targeting the communist bureaucracy this time.
wow.
A lot of officials who were responsible for the Great Leap Forward, who were responsible for the anti-rightist campaign, are now themselves being targeted during Cultural Revolution.
Wow.
Because they also created a lot of enemies during anti-rightist campaign and their unpopular policies implementing the Great Leap Forward.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Example would be the governor of Sichuan, Li Qingquan. He was because Sichuan was most affected by Great Leap Forward. Sichuan is a traditional bread basket or rice basket of China, but
Mm,
during the Great Leap Forward, uh, uh, one of the problem with Great Leap Forward was that the officials are encouraged to exaggerate the grain yield, right? Because
right.
for them, they say, oh, because we implementing socialism correctly, so our grain yield went up four folds or five folds, and then it
Yep.
became a competition among the Chinese bureaucrats to compete who can make up
Yep.
the bigger numbers. But
Yep.
then the central government says, oh, great, we have all these grains. Now we need them. Please requisition these grains because we need them to build industries to
Right.
trade with Soviet Union. And Sichuan used to be a major rice producing region,
Mm,
and part because this overinflated claims about harvest. Sichuan had to send a large amount of its grain it produced outside the province, and that led to starvation. And even when the starvation happened, there were still quotas coming in because they say that the cities, like big cities like Beijing and Shanghai, were facing food shortages. Sichuan was tasked to provide food, so a lot of the and this is another thing, because Shanghai and Beijing are a lot more visible, right?
Mm,
Because they're big cities. Everybody know, if city folks are running short of food, everybody know about it. But
right.
whereas in Sichuan countryside, nobody will know, if food is running out. So
No.
so the Sichuan governor enforces policy of shipping grain out of Sichuan, causing mass starvation. So he was very hated. And
Wow.
during Cultural Revolution, um, the rebels or the Red Guards, attacked his home, and they actually beat up his son. Uh, they almost beat his son to death. And his son, before his son died, even like they beat his son to near death, but before his son even died, they tossed him into incinerator. So and because what his father did, this is kind of thing that happened during Cultural Revolution. There was a lot of anarchy, a lot of chaos, a lot of people use that time to settle scores. But uh, but my mom said something about Cultural Revolution that was interesting compared to Great Rightist Campaign. He said She said, yes, our family got screwed by both, but if it wasn't for Great Cultural Revolution, those Chinese communist cadres wouldn't have known what it feels like to be targeted. Like,
Huh.
like because they're the ones who were carrying out the anti-rightist campaign in
Right.
1957. But
Right.
by 1966, they themselves became the target, just
Wow.
because they were in the bureaucracy. So there was a lot of that, but in the end, my mom, despite her professful love of Chairman Mao and denouncing her own parents, my mom still wasn't allowed to go to college, and she was so she went to a nursing school, which was like a 2-year nursing school. Afterwards, um, this is a time when if you go to any type of institution, higher education, you get assigned jobs once you graduate, right?
Sure.
By the state. And of course, as the children of bad elements, my mom and my dad didn't get the the pick of the
Right.
leader, because um, my my dad my dad was originally assigned to go to a countryside in Sichuan, but then there was one of his classmates was assigned to go to the Tibetan region on the Tibetan plateau, and he didn't want to go. So he
Huh.
worked his connections with the teachers to change assignment. So in the end, he got my dad's assignment to go to countryside in Sichuan. My dad got sent to the Tibetan plateau,
Huh.
and my dad was an electrical engineering graduate. He got
Sure.
to send to he's got to send to the Ganzi Tibetan Autonomous Prefecture in western Sichuan, which is basically it's a culturally and geographically part of the Tibetan plateau, and it's part
Sure.
of the Tibetan. It's all like the majority population is all Tibetan.
Huh.
When my dad got assigned there, the local officials didn't know what to do with him. It's like, oh, you are a college grad. What did you study? My dad's like electrical engineering, and the party secretary didn't know what electrical engineering is, but he understood. He's like, oh, engineering. Okay, you can go help build roads. So he got
Oh,
assigned to
wow.
to do road building, and
Wow.
and and then my mom, she also happened to assign to work in Tibet. She got assigned with a bunch of 19, 20-year-old nurses fresh out of nursing school. They got assigned to work on a high altitude mobile clinic.
Wow.
So to work to serve the Tibetan herders, because in those regions they have uh, there's they have winters and summer pastures. In the summertime, the nomads will drive their herds up in the mountains to
Uh-huh.
pasture their herds. And so they have this mobile clinic to serve the herdsmen, to nomads. This is a time when Mao also did the barefoot doctors, right, to provide health services to everyone. And at my mom, they were camped out on like uh, she told me it was 4,000 meters above sea level,
Jeez. Wow.
in a very kind of ramshackle mobile clinics to serve the local Tibetan nomads.
Huh.
And but eventually, eventually the local government decided to build a small hydroelectric hydroelectric power generation plant. And then they remember, oh, we have an electrical engineer,
There you go.
college grads. So then my dad got to work on hydroelectric station, at least something related to his field.
Nice.
And then he met my mom. So in a way, if cultural revolution in a way is a tragedy, but if it wasn't for cultural revolution, my parents would never met.
Yeah, you wouldn't have been born, basically.
I would have been born. I was
There you go.
conceived. Yeah, I was conceived on the Tibetan plateau.
Wow.
And and then 19 so there was a time, just to relate a similar story. So back then everything was rationed, like one my mom was telling, like, one time when she already had my sister, but I wasn't born yet, that there was a new shipment of textile of cloth that was shipped to their town in this Tibetan region, and everybody was rushing to get their share. They say they tell her, like, go go get your share, before they rang out, because you might get you might get enough clothes to make quilts for your daughter when she for the time when she gets married.
Ha.
And my mom said something at the time. She's like, I don't believe I will stay here all my life.
Huh.
I don't believe that this will never change. Like in a way, they wanted to go back home, right?
Sure, sure.
In fact, they named my sister Weijia, which in Chinese sounded like Huijia, which means going home.
Huh.
And my first Chinese name was also playing off of that, was called Wei Chen, which sounds like Hui Chen, going back to the city. and, and then so that was 1976 when I was born.
Okay, so that
One
was
month
like the
after
end
Mao.
of the
Yeah,
revolution.
yeah, one month after Mao died, and basically in the month I was born, the PLA general Ye Jianyin and the Mao successor Hua Guofeng basically uh, arrested the Gang of Four, right,
Right.
and then put an end to the Cultural Revolution, and
Wow.
and after that in 1978, um, Deng Xiaoping was rehabilitated because Hua Guofeng, even though he was a designated successor by Mao, he had a lot of legitimacy, but Deng Xiaoping had a lot of practical experience running
Right.
the country, and he also has a lot of connection among both the army and also the civilian bureaucracy. He knows people who knows people.
Yep.
So they brought Deng Xiaoping back to help run the country, and Deng Xiaoping, in a way, he's a more hands-off boss. He sent his protege Hu Yaobang to rehabilitate. One of the most important things Hu Yaobang did was to rehabilitate the Chinese intellectuals who
Right.
were uh, who were persecuted during Cultural Revolution. Like
Yeah.
to take off their hat, take off their rightist hats, and to allow them basically come back to the fold and to contribute to building the country. And that
Right.
was I think one of the most important contributions. And that also included Another thing about Cultural Revolution is schools are closed. So my dad was
Mm,
lucky that he got in school in 1963, right? So 3 years before the Cultural Revolution started. So
yeah.
when Cultural Revolution started in 1966, he still have 1 year left. And they were so at that time, my dad's like a lot of college students. They went around China because at the time they could board the train for free. They went to China, basically to go to rallies to support the Cultural Revolution. But at the end, after 1 year, the school the school officials and the school instructors say, okay, that enough is enough. You guys still need to finish your college education. So they made them come back another year, and
Wow.
so my dad finally graduated in 1968,
Okay.
and then he was sent to Tibet. He had his college degree, but then in 1978, what Deng Xiaoping and Hu Yaobang had done was to reopen the schools. So now
Mm,
the colleges are open again. Now they're redoing the college entrance exam. All the Chinese youth who have been sent to the countryside, now they can go take the college entrance exam and go back to college or go to
wow.
college.
Okay.
And my dad capitalized on that opportunity to apply to grad school,
Wow.
and because of my mom is from a city of Chongqing, so he applied to the Chongqing University, and where my grandpa, my mom's dad, used to take night classes in the 1930s, and so my dad became a grad student, um, and then my mom had to wait until I think 1984 or 1983 to um, come back to work through my dad because work as a nurse at my dad's university, Chongqing University. So I grew up on the Chongqing University campus,
Mm,
and when I was born, the Cultural Revolution was already over,
sure.
and at the time, the energy was that everything was getting better and better,
Wow.
and because I remember 1980, my mom, so she works in the Tibetan region, but she was saving her salaries, and so she bought her parents, my grandparents, a set of black and white television, and
Huh.
that was the first television in my grandparents' village, the residential compound. So all the little kids
Wow.
would come
Huh.
to my grandparents' home to watch TV.
Wow.
1980s. That's when we first had TV. It was a black and white TV,
Huh.
and and also I remember at that time China couldn't produce a lot of things. So I believe that black and white TV might be China produced, but at that time in the early 1980s, all the color TV they
Uh-huh.
had to be imported. They're like Japanese imports,
Right.
color TVs, and you couldn't get them like as a because you to buy them you need hard currency. You can't just buy them with RMB. You
Right.
have to have
Wow.
like a US dollar or yen or some kind of currency, and then you go to this what's called the designated friendship store where you exchange your currency, dollar or yen, to this to foreign currency certificate, and then with that
Huh.
certificate, then you can buy imported goods like
Wow.
the and at that time, what's the most desired goods is like transistor radio. Japan made Japanese made transistor radio, and
Wow.
and and it was in 1980s when at the time when my uncle got married, the four items you must have when you get married is radio, a bicycle, uh, not even TV because TV is too rare. So
Sure.
radio, bicycle, a sewing machine, and
Uh-huh.
I can't remember what the fourth thing was, but there's a four big must have item for marriage in
Wow.
1980s. And my dad, because my dad and this was also the time when the exchange with foreign countries was opened up again. So my dad went to a conference in Beijing tech conference where he met this Chinese American professor from
Hmm.
Illinois. And
Hmm.
so this Chinese American professor was very impressed with my dad and agreed to take upon him as a grad student.
Wow.
And so this is how my dad got the sponsorship to come to US in 1985 to pursue his
Wow.
PhD degree. Now, now my another thing is my dad actually didn't know English, right? Because back in when his time in 1960s, there were two-track foreign language schools in China. You either learn English or Russian, but you don't
Wow.
get a choice. You get assigned. If you're unlucky, well, it depends. You're lucky, unlucky, you get
Sure.
Russian or English. And that system even lasted until I went to junior high because at the time there was a lot of concern about parents like is my my child gonna get put into a Russian school and then I think it's right around the time when we were going to start foreign languages they phased out the Russian, so it was all English
I
because
see. Okay.
this was right around the end of Cold War, right? Like the by the
Right.
time I
Right.
went to junior high, it was like 1989, 1990.
Yeah.
So they finally phased out Russian from curriculum and
Well, I
just
was actually gonna say, I was gonna ask, uh, after the Soviet Union collapsed too, that's another thing that I wanted to touch upon. I know we're
yeah.
focusing on Deng Xiaoping, but how was the fall of the Soviet Union? How did that hit, your family and, China as a whole, do you think?
Well, when I was still in China, the Soviet Union still existed. So I
Right,
left
right.
China in 1990. But at that time, the writing is on the wall, so to speak, right? I
Hmm.
mean, one of the thing is like, for example, I mentioned China. My dad studied Russian. Studied
Huh.
Russian in high school. He studied Russian in college. So he learned, but he learned English on the side. He
Wow.
did self learning English on the side. That's how he was able to, like come to US. And
Sure.
by the time he come to US, he already know a little bit English.
Yeah.
To get by. And my and it was interesting because the late so when I was went to when I first started school in 1982, I would get all those like hands down materials from my sister, right? And
Ah.
those notebooks and stuff, and some of the notebooks that still have like earlier slogans like anti-Soviet slogans from like 1979. I remember
Wow.
1979 was the time of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which
Right,
China
right.
opposed, right? And China at this time was in the U.S. camp. It was
Huh.
in the Western camp opposing the Soviet Union, both in Afghanistan and also yeah so at that time there was a lot of anti-Soviet propaganda, but even in the early 80s, but even by the time I started school in 1982 by 84, when I read these anti-Soviet slogan, it seems too much. It was like, wow, that's a little overboard, like it talks about we must down with the Soviet revisionism, down with the
Wow.
socialist imperialism, right?
Wow.
In 1984, it already seemed kind of outdated and archaic because
Sure.
China already started to improve relationship with Soviet Union by mid
Huh.
80s, and by late 80s, by starting 1986, 1987, we finally are getting more Soviet film and Soviet TV are finally making their way into China again. Because for the longest time, from culture from Sino-Soviet split from like early 1960s
Yep.
to like early 1980s, this is a block of 20 years where
Right.
all the Soviet produced materials are just disappear entirely from
Wow.
China. Um,
Wow.
but by 19 late 80s, we're starting to seeing the Soviet TV on TV again. There was a popular show, All Is Quiet. They're All Is Quiet on the no, not All Is Quiet on the Western Front.
Yeah, I was gonna
Is
say.
no, no, that's a different war.
Right.
It's a famous Soviet movie called I have to look it up, but it's about this
Sure.
group of female Soviet soldiers during World War II, who was led by this a male lieutenant, and it's about the whole movie is about them, and so that was a huge popular series. Um,
Nice.
and there was actually a lot of Soviet nostalgia too, because people of my parents' generation, like Jiang Zemin. Oh, Jiang Zemin is a little bit older. No, Jiang Zemin is not my. Jiang Zemin is a little bit older, but Jiang Zemin was educated
Huh.
uh, in Russian, right?
Uh-huh.
And he and people like that generation of Chinese leadership. Jiang Zemin was initially educated in English at the time when he went to college, because that was still before liberation. But after liberation, Russian became popular. So Jiang Zemin know how to sing like Russian songs and stuff, and so there was that kind of Soviet nostalgia in 1980s China, right? And then
Interesting. Huh.
yeah, and this is also the time a lot of the Chinese peddlers starting to go to Soviet Union to do cross border trade. So the border finally
Interesting.
opened up again,
Right.
and at the time it was interesting because the Soviet was kind of the state industry was already kind of collapsing.
Right.
So so there was a lot of barter trade. A lot of the Chinese peddlers, individual traders, that will take Chinese goods like Chinese made products to go to Soviet Union to barter for things like uh, uh, back then, what is Soviet goods like the old Soviet military uniform, like
Wow.
the Red Army
Really?
uniform, yeah, and and things like that. It was a brisk trade at the time. It was a big deal. A lot of people, because the
Fascinating.
border finally opened up after 20 years, and there was a
Huh.
lot of cross border, and people were shocked. Actually, many people were shocked when they went to Soviet Union, because we in China, Soviet is always seen as like the big brother, right?
Right.
Like the big brother, and people always Soviet, like in Mao's kind of definition. There's three worlds, right? The first world is the superpowers, the Soviet Union and United States.
Uh-huh.
The second world is like all the U.S. hanger-ons, all the client states,
Yep.
like, and then um, and then the third world is the global south, right?
Right.
So the understanding has always been that China, we belong in the global south, we're of the
Mm.
third world, and Soviet Union, the old brother, is still in the first world, right?
Right.
And when a lot of the so Chinese traders started doing cross-border trade, and they were actually kind of shocked that like in the late 80s Soviet Union, the kind of like people obviously still living better off than people in China in general, but there's lack of goods. There's it's not the kind of the kind of the utopia they had imagined, or that they had been told in the 1950s. The Soviets were so advanced, or so doing so well, and
Hmm.
and and because what they saw was kind of crumbling infrastructure that were already happening, even before the collapse of the Soviet Union. And yeah, so that was that. But should we go back to
Yeah, no, I
Xiaoping?
was gonna say, like, I was really hanging on everything you were saying because it's
Okay.
really fascinating, and you can all of a sudden, basically, when you were born, you really seen the transition from the
Yes.
Cultural Revolution and Mao, all the
Yes.
way down to Deng Xiaoping and what he
Yes.
instituted, how he opened it up, and when your dad was able to travel to the United States, and then yourself in the '90s, how everything was continuing to develop. It's
Yeah.
like you said, nothing really slowed down once Deng Xiaoping came
No.
in. It was just all developing. I wanted um, to say, witnessing all that, or were you surprised on how developed China is now ever since Deng Xiaoping came into power, or was there like you never would have thought China would be something like this?
I will tell you, back in when I was in the first grade, in 1982, with my classmate, we used to talk about what the future would hold, what the future would look like. But
Huh.
as little boys, we were saying, oh, now that the opening and reforming is happening on all fronts, right? What happens if the the opening like later social mores are so open by the time we grow up that like we would even like would you like be able to hold would you hold do PDA in public? Would you hold hands and kiss in public? And that
Wow.
was unimaginable in 1982, right? Like now it's like just normal for Chinese
Sure,
teenagers.
sure.
Yeah, like
That's
in
amazing.
1982, that would be like whoa, that would be like the ultimate. We get to hold hands and
Wow.
kiss in make out in public.
Oh, wow, that's amazing.
Yeah,
But yeah,
because
and it was, pushing that, obviously pushing cultural norms too and everything, but
yes,
also
yes,
just like the opening up just really not blew everybody's mind, obviously, but really uh, the sky was the limit. There was really nothing
yes,
that was
yes.
restraining anybody to kind of see how the economy, culture, and society can explode from here. And that was um, even after the Soviet Union fall, I mean, uh, Francis Fukuyama said, "Oh, that's it. That's the end of history," and it just completely
Oh,
ignoring the
yeah,
sleeping giant that China was being, or not even sleeping.
yeah.
It was developing, and it just had these economic numbers that were booming, growing, growing, growing every single time. And
I remember Gerald Segal, who was a sinologist, China watcher,
uh,
British China watcher, just before he died. Um, I think in 1998, he published an article. It's like, we should treat China as it is. It's just a mid power, nothing more.
ugh,
China is basically no different from Brazil. It's like, why should we accord it respect it doesn't deserve? It's
wow, wow,
this, yeah, this was 1998. And I mean, in a way, he's right because in 1980, if you just look at 1998 data, sure, he can say China, economic wise, whatever is just like Brazil, but he's ignoring the trajectory. The
right,
trajectory since 1978. I mean, I seen it, I witnessed it, I lived it. I remember our first black and white television and the excitement it generated, and
right,
and another thing is I like to remind people and emphasize the the emphasis on education because during Cultural Revolution, not only was school was closed, but there was also a slogan called "知识越多越反动," which means the more knowledge you have, the more reactionary you are because you
wow,
get all these
oh
bad
wow,
ideas.
anti-intellectual,
you,
yeah, yeah,
you get
yeah,
all these because that was swept away with before an opening.
wow,
Like the because with the opening of college, like that opened up the advancement. I think the 1972, the opening of the college entrance exam was the
uh-huh,
biggest kind of social mobility moment because it allowed a lot of the Chinese kids from rural areas, from poor farming background, they when they would took that entrance exam, pass the test. Of course, it was very hard. They have to
right,
do very well to make into a Chinese university in
mm,
1980s. But those people who graduated, uh, in 1980s, now they're the pillars of the Chinese economy. They're the
right.
pillars
They're
of
the
Chinese
leaders of the
society.
business world and everything today.
Yes, yes,
Huh.
yes. I mean, that's something. Another thing, people we're kind of jumping ahead a little bit, but that's something people don't realize. This is also the people who went through college in the 80s are also the generation that many of them took part in the Tiananmen protests in 1989, like the end of Deng Xiaoping era,
Right.
right? But for those people who stayed in China after the protest, even for the people who participated test, these people are now driving China forward. These
Wow.
people who may be former protesters, they're now the captain of industry in China. They're
Stunning.
the pillars. Yeah,
Stunning.
you have to
And
keep that in mind. And
yeah,
even like the I think Tiananmen is probably one of the most controversial aspect of
right,
Deng Xiaoping era, but
right.
uh, I know a lot of that generation because, as I mentioned, I grew up on University of Chongqing campus, right?
Uh-huh.
I hang out with college students all the time because at the time I would just after school I would go to the university library to study, and that's
Uh-huh.
when like a lot of the college students will also do their self studies, and so
Right.
I would just hang out with the college students. I would talk to them, so I know
There you
the
go.
generation that did the Tiananmen protest. I talked to them, and I nowadays I still talk to them, and what they told me is, um, their evaluation of the events, their hindsight through hindsight, their evaluation of Tiananmen have changed.
Mm,
They while they regard it as a tragedy that the Tiananmen protest ended in the way it did. But
right.
now looking back, looking at what happened with the end of Soviet Union, with the collapse
Mm-hmm.
of Soviet Union, the result of shock therapy in Russia, and witness the development in China, they felt in 1989 the protest needed to end.
Right.
They just didn't end in the manner that it did, but they
Right.
agreed the protest must should have the government was right in controlling put an end to the protest, so it didn't spiral out of control, so China didn't end up like the former Soviet bloc. And
Exactly. And I think that was, when I was reading about the incident, I was really stunned how Deng Deng Xiaoping was immovable. He was not going to. It did shake up a lot of Chinese politics after the incident, but
yes,
Deng was still adamant about we're not going to, Western bourgeois liberalism. We're not
yeah,
giving up on that. We're not. We're still one party sort of rule. We're
yeah,
Democrat, doing our democracy in our
democratic
own sort of way.
centralism,
Yeah, I
democratic
mean,
centralism, yeah,
exactly.
yeah,
It's but the thing is that looking back, he was like, yeah, he was right. If
yeah,
we fell like the Soviets or just became another democracy because of these protests, we never
yeah.
would have had the prosperity that China has today. I mean, even
I mean,
talking about the trajectory, this is what I really get frustrated with capitalist and liberal economists in the West when they're saying,
yes,
oh, China's just capitalist. It's like, no, when
no.
you actually read Deng Xiaoping's writing, he was talking about, 2000, 2050, and how we're going to raise our GDP up to a certain point and everything. It was a big plan.
If China is capitalist, Jack Ma would be writing the constitution.
And look at him now,
and yeah, and Jack Ma would be dictating Chinese policies, and there
Right,
would have been
right,
no problem with his end IPO, right?
right,
that would be
exactly.
rushed through in a jiffy, and and that's why like that's the biggest difference that people don't get. In China, the state controls
Right,
controls the market capitalism, right? And
right.
what's a Chen Yun said about the birds in the cage, right?
Yep, yep,
And the state still has an overwhelming control,
exactly.
whereas in U.S. we have the business oligarchs running our
Mhm.
state. We have
Yep.
people like Jeff Bezos, Peter Thiel's funding think
Elon
tanks,
Musk.
running newspapers. Yeah,
Yep.
they're the ones funding lobbies to influence our policies. They don't get to do that in China. In China,
Right, but like, and this is the success of China, and I'm glad that we kind of touched upon your personal experience and your family's experience and how it all evolved with Deng Xiaoping, because it truly does show that, uh, you know, with a plan and under the CPC, how they were able to fight against liberal influences, the Western influences, and especially trying to open up their economy the way that they did. There able to continue their growth while looking at actual Western liberal capitalism and how it's falling right now because of crises, because of whether it's the mortgage crisis in 2008 or another economic downturn because of COVID, crisis after crisis, people are just suffering
Yeah.
in these sort of wealthiest countries in the world. So,
One of the things Deng Xiaoping pointed out, which is very important, is he said socialism would fail if we fail to provide for our people, if we
right,
fail to provide a good life for our people. Because he
exactly.
realized that, through the different political campaigns from Anti-Rightist Campaign, Great Leap Forward through Cultural Revolution, people are getting tired of ideological struggles. They just
Yep,
want, most people just want better life. And how to prove that socialism is really superior to the capitalism is to do better, to provide better life for your people. And
right.
that's what,
Improve their material conditions, improve their
exactly,
prosperity.
exactly. That's
Yep.
very key because in 19, I in the initial phase of reform and opening, it was very shocking to the Chinese population because throughout from Great Leap Forward throughout Cultural Revolution, my mom's generation, they have been told that the people in the West, they live in 水生火热之中, which means in the fire and water. They're between fire and water, and we are in China, where really empowers the workers and the peasants. But then they see how people live in U.S. They see the difference, the gap in the living standard, and that produced
Hmm.
a shock. But on the other hand, it also motivated the Chinese people of that generation to play catch up, to
Right.
to learn at one point, to learn from the West, to learn the technology, to learn the different way of doing things, but with the goal to close the gap, to
Yep.
really make China a better place. I think
Yep.
that's very important, and that has happened in the last 40 years. What we have seen.
Yeah, and it's really telling how, uh, with all that said, where China is today and how it's not stopping. Even the most liberal economists would say that China, even I think I heard that China has cut its race to be the biggest economy in the world from 10 years now down to 7 years
Yeah.
because of how the West has handled their economy during the COVID
And,
crisis.
and also caveat with that is that that's measured in the nominal GDP, which is measured in U.S. dollars,
Yeah,
and
on
with the currency exchange rate, it's all kind of it's all kind of hand waving because
yep,
if we accept the some U.S. conservative argument that Chinese currency is
ugh,
undervalued.
yeah,
If
no,
Chinese, then what it means if Chinese currency appreciate against U.S. say by 20%, then the nominal GDP will go up 20%.
I mean, okay,
Yeah, yeah,
there you
right.
go.
So I think yeah, I think by again, the dollar hegemony is also coming to an end.
Right,
U.S. is
exactly.
doing everything to help it along. So we'll
Yeah,
probably see that soon. Definitely in the foreseeable future.
there you
Yeah.
go. And let's wrap up with this final question then. Um, with all this said, what's your viewpoint and what's also your family viewpoint of Deng Xiaoping today?
Oh, okay. So, my because my parents, because of what they had gone through, had experience under in Cultural Revolution, I think they're broadly supportive
Mm,
of Deng Xiaoping. My parents, though they did not agree with Deng Xiaoping handling of Tiananmen. They thought you should it should not have been hand. It's a, I don't agree with my parents 100% politically.
Uh-huh.
Keep that in mind. My parents are in U.S. They're now U.S.
Sure.
citizens. They vote Republican. Thank
Oh,
God this
wow.
time thank God this time they didn't vote Trump. Like
That's
I'm
yeah, I was
scared
gonna
to
say
ask
that
them, but
that's kind of similar to my parents, but
yeah, yeah. So thank God this time they didn't vote Trump, but we don't necessarily see eye to eye. But their evaluation, of course, Deng Xiaoping era was 100% improvement
mm,
before. I mean, especially in their own circumstances, they were
yeah,
allowed finally back to the city to pursue the career they wanted. And
sure.
my dad was able to pursue his study, which allowed him to come to the United States. And so yeah, so they are definitely broad supportive. And as I mentioned, even students who participated in KMN, even the students who didn't who are still living in US that I talked
Mm,
to, vast majority of them, some diehard dissident, they already gone off the far end,
yeah,
but the vast majority of the former student protesters that I spoke to, they all have come to the conclusion that the protest needed to end. They just wish that it didn't end in the manner that it did.
right,
So
right.
yeah, so that's
And
their own conclusion.
I was gonna say, what's your point of view of Deng Xiaoping?
Yeah, I think Deng Xiaoping was in the right place in the right time, and he
Yeah,
he did it what needs to be done. Deng Xiaoping, like we should not like put him on a pedestal. Deng Xiaoping made
right.
plenty of mistakes, right? And Deng Xiaoping was also, let's remember, I mean, it's also, we should not say there's like a dichotomy. It's also a
Uh-huh.
mistake to say there's a dichotomy between Deng and Mao. They're all
Mm,
connected. It's part of the
yep,
evolution, right?
yep,
And because Mao was part of, Deng was part of Mao's revolution, and Deng was a very loyal supporter of
yep,
Mao up through 1960, right?
right,
Their difference only start to emerge is in how to govern the country. I think both of them wanted, um, basically, uh, have China continue on the Marxist Leninism path, but they what they differ is the approach to take to get there,
yep,
right?
yep,
So Deng Xiaoping was advocating a gradualist approach, where
right,
Mao wanted to rush things along because Mao was getting impatient, he was getting up in age, he wanted to see everything happen in his
right,
lifetime. Um, and what Deng Xiaoping did though was he learned from his mistakes, because
yep,
he was the one who executed, he was the one who carried out Mao's policy during both Anti-Rightist Campaign and the Great Leap Forward. He
mm,
saw the aftermath, and he
yep,
made correction. Right, I think that's his strength was to emphasize on the pragmatic side of things.
yep,
I mean,
yep,
he's talking about, uh, the building Chinese socialism is like, uh, feeling the stone while you cross a river, right? Because it's a completely new experience. Like,
yeah,
this has not been done to build, uh, towards socialism in a mostly a backward agrarian based society, in
right,
like a country that have not had industrialized yet, right?
right,
And he has to be done in a way that suit China's own circumstances, and I think he
right.
did that very well.
Awesome, awesome. I mean,
Yeah.
well said. I think this really did touch a lot on uh, reflects what we were talking about with the development of the cultural revolutions, the struggles that Deng Xiaoping had between the ultra left and the reformers trying to institute the policies and kind of butting heads with, wait, is this really Marxist? Or no, we have to, blaze our path forward, our own path forward with our own characteristics and everything. And it was really, I personally think Deng Xiaoping really uh, set a new course for socialism altogether, and to
Mhm.
show that the gradual transition takes a long time, and his primary stage of socialism, like saying, hey, this transformation towards socialism has to take longer than we thought, and be patient because we have to grow our productive forces, the material wealth, and really work on uh, comforting or getting the people together to move forward on a economic level. You know,
And also his prioritizing of improving people's livelihood, people's
right,
conditions. Because if socialism doesn't do that, then what's the point, right?
right.
I mean,
I mean,
that should be the goal we all work toward to, is to improve human conditions, to improve life quality of life for common people.
right. I mean, the whole point was being better than capitalism at that, And
Yes.
I think Deng Xiaoping, it wasn't under Mao that showed that. I think even the Gang of Four were trying to convince people, no, poor socialism is okay, poor communism is okay.
Right.
It's like, wait a minute,
Yeah.
no,
Yeah.
no,
Yeah.
no. It's all about getting what the people need a lot more efficiently than capitalism can, and without the
Yes.
exploitation, without the suffering, and we can
Yes.
do that together. And Deng Xiaoping did it brilliantly, let alone with the most populous country on earth.
Yes.
So, and it really did give a pathway for the global South to, lead their own prosperity as well. But
Yes.
with all that said, oh man, this was a great conversation. I really can't wait for it. But thank you so much, Carl. Do you have anything else you want to say or anything?
No, I mean, I said a lot. I hope I wasn't like wandering all over the place, because I felt
No,
like
not even.
I.
I mean, it all connects. We were talking about your grandparents and then your mom and dad and your uncles.
Yeah.
It all gave a really, really solid picture on what happened during this time, and with a little background, political background of the Civil War, and then the Great Leap Forward, all the way up to today. It was great. I'm gonna really, because the thing is that I'm trying to condense all of this in like a 30, 40-minute video, and I'm gonna have to try to figure out what parts are gonna be
Okay.
so juicy to put in. So, but
Okay,
like I
that's fine.
said, I'm gonna give you the full unedited
Yeah.
version on YouTube, so you can put it on your podcast. But either way, we'll get the juicy bits on here. So
Great, great. Thank you again for the opportunity for to
no
invite
worries,
me to your
anytime,
show.
anytime. And yeah, let me pause the recording here.
Okay.